Greetings to one and all, and shout outs to everybody. It's been a while. It's been a long time. You may remember me as your forgotten host, Rick Richards, Rick Rockwell sometimes, whatever the case may be. I know it's been a while. And, we've all changed. I've gotten, a few more gray hairs, a little rougher, a little more creased up, a little rougher around the edges. But you know what? I thought, let's get the band back because tomorrow marks exactly 5 years since I did my very first video on the COVID Chronicles, which came to be known as the COVID crash, as things unraveled very quickly. 5 years tomorrow. And, I thought it's a good time for a retrospective on the whole COVID situation and everything that went down and just kind of reflect, 5 years later. This, I think, is going to be seen as something much, much bigger the further out we get from it. I think a lot of people are still kind of in shock over everything that went down. It was just so bizarre in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I thought 5 years, hey, good time to do a retrospective. I'm a long way away from where I was. Of course, at the time, I was on the west coast of British Columbia. Now I am in the great state of Texas, North Texas, up by Denton. And that's a story in itself, a story people often ask me, what made you decide to leave Canada and go to Texas? And a lot of that is wrapped up in COVID, but that is a story for another day. So, first, let's take a look at everything that went down over COVID. And I think with COVID, you really have to kind of break things into two separate phases. Phase one was kind of the shock and the awe of this virus loosed upon the world, apocalyptic scenes. Are we all going to die? Zombies, whatever. Just a cataclysm, right? And then, of course, phase two would be more of the vaccine rollout and everything that went along with that. So I won't take too long. This you could do 10, 20 hours on it really if you wanted to. But let's just kind of breeze through and let's take a look at some of the things. Let's recap how things went down and how things kind of changed forever as a result. So again, greetings to one and all. Shout outs to everybody. Don't know who watches anymore. I got mentioning the whole cough thing. I got kind of shadow banned a few weeks into the videos, but decided to keep doing them for a while anyways. So anyways, let's go to phase one. And phase one, I'll kind of get into my own recollections, and they're probably pretty similar to a lot of people. I had first heard about the virus, and this was nothing new. It seems like every few years there's a foot and mouth, or there's an avian flu, or there's something. What was it before that? Before COVID, there was one just a few years prior to that. I think it was, I don't know, was it swine flu or West Nile virus, or there was something else where mosquitoes were shrinking the heads of newborn babies. I mean, there's just every couple of years there's one coming from some backwater somewhere, right? And you never really know. Is it coming from a backwater or is it coming from a lab, right? But anyways, I'd first heard about this and, didn't think a lot about it. I was actually at an airport in Toronto coming back from my birthday vacation, 50th birthday in Cuba at the time. And I had heard about it, didn't think a whole lot about it. But the momentum kept growing and kept growing. And my coworker, David, started showing me some videos at the time from China. And if any of you recall the videos we were seeing at China in the early stages, they were pretty shocking. There was people, kind of freezing and foaming at the mouth and being welded in buildings. And it was just absolute meltdown. And that's the first thing we have to reflect on. Even COVID out, but kind of pre-reaction. What was going on? Why were we seeing so many videos like this? Was an actual psychological attempt to just really build up fear and a sense of paranoia in people? Or is it just people's nature to just kind of feed into that sort of entertainment thing? Like for the same reason people watch movies that scare them. They like to be scared. They like a thrill. They like to be entertained in a way, right? And maybe that's kind of what helps circulate these things and people produce more of them as a result, right? That's really hard to say. But one thing we can say for sure is those videos definitely laid the ground for the extreme overreactions we were about to see. And at first, it was very mixed messages. At first, if you recall, a lot of people were insisting that we, ban people from China coming into the country, Canada in this case, and probably the US as well. Were avoiding shops in Chinatown and Chinese businesses. And of course, the virtue signaling powers that be came out and said, "Oh, how dare you? This is extremely racist. This is prejudice that you meet something like this with hate." In Italy, of all places, they even came up with a program, Hug a Chinese, which in itself seems kind of weird. But yeah, so I mean, just these are the kind of typical things. And that was sort of the reaction that, I would have predicted. That was a little more true to type for the ruling powers, right? Kind of this finger wagging is always part of it, pushing people into being called racist and this sort of thing, and answer everything with a hug, and then if you don't, you'll get hit with a baton kind of thing, right? Um, but then things started to change really, really rapidly. And the fear of this virus, as February kind of rolled into March, the fear of the virus just kept kind of growing and growing, even with those admonishments. And for me, things really got real when the NBA decided to suspend their season. I mean, to me, that was a shocking, shocking thing. And at the same night they suspended the season, I was sitting in a judo class where my kids were, and uh, the judo instructor mentioned that they would be suspending classes for at least 2 weeks. And if you recall, this was going into spring break, so in a sense, you wonder if that was planned because it's a lot less abrupt if people are already essentially planning a 2 week break. Like a good portion of the population is planning a 2 week break. Their kids are going to be home for 2 weeks. Some of them are taking time off work for 2 weeks. So in that sense, the timing is really, it's kind of suspect that it all sort of happened then. And I remember saying to my friend, um, he said to me, a guy named Manny Amar, rest in peace, Manny. He was actually killed in Surrey, British Columbia, um, about 2.5 years ago. He's a good friend of mine. Anyways, we used to chat a lot, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and he said, "This isn't going to be over in 2 weeks." And I said, "What, man? You're crazy." So we bet. We bet $100. I bet him a tub of protein, a big 5 pound tub of protein, and he bet me $100. And I lost that bet, didn't I? Because that 2 weeks came and went, and it was a pretty shocking night for me. That very night, I went home and I couldn't sleep that night. I woke up at something like 3 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. So I got in my car and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to a 24-hour grocery store and stock up on groceries. I thought, if we got to sit around for 2 weeks, I want to make sure I'm well prepared and all that sort of thing. And I drove around all of Vancouver and everything was closed. And even the places that were opening soon, there was lineups for them. And I'm like, wow, this is really kind of getting wild, right? And yeah, and that's how it started pretty much for all of us, a similar sort of thing. And so then we go into the first phase, lockdown, right? And lockdown on its own is a very strange term. Lockdown is a prison term, right? Lockdown. Who's locking you down, right? Uh, yeah, we go to lockdown and stay at home orders. Some places called it lockdown, some called it stay at home. And those local governments that didn't want to be quite as authoritarian call it stay at home. The rest call it lockdown, and pretty much everyone referred to it as a lockdown. And that's pretty wild stuff, isn't it? Lockdown. You haven't committed a crime, you don't have the actual virus, yet you're treated as a sick person or a criminal and essentially locked down. Needless to say, I after the first few days, I pretty much disregarded the lockdown and I went where I want. And I didn't want to play along with that because very soon into this thing, just by going to grocery stores, I think before even the 2 weeks was up, I started talking to cashiers and I said, "Do you know anybody that's gotten this virus yet?" They're like, "No." And I go, "Do you know any?" No, I say, "Do you know anybody that's died from COVID yet?" And they're all like, "No." And I said, "Do you know anybody that's gotten it?" And they're like, "No." And for people that were at the time dealing with more members of the mass public than anybody else, that was pretty strange, right? And that's kind of when I started thinking, okay, this we may be overreacting a little bit, and you can kind of see this through the early COVID chronicles that I was doing. That I was trying my best to be as cautious as possible and take everything as seriously as possible. Um, but I started having doubts really quickly into this thing, and you know, the effect on business was absolutely appalling. I mean, you know, just for example, my business personally went from doing X amount of dollars to Y amount of dollars basically overnight, like a 90% drop. And you got people telling you, hey, man, just sit on the couch. How hard is that? Right? Sit on the couch for a couple weeks, or just take an extended vacation. It doesn't work that way, man. When you've been building something, you're putting your blood, sweat, and tears into something for 10 years to have it just disappear is it's not great, right? And it's not an easy feeling, and it's not something to, some stuff like that gives you an incredible amount of anxiety. We saw travel restrictions. The US border was closed with Canada. And if you remember, there were tons of people stranded all in these different places all over the world. And, some of them couldn't fly, couldn't get on planes, couldn't get through the Canadian border. Um, Australia and New Zealand basically just locked their entire countries off from the rest of the world. And one thing that was interesting very quickly on, I mean, booking flights was almost impossible. And yet, for some reason, I drove out to the airport one day and I noticed we were still getting flights coming in from China. And this was right at the peak of, the lockdown mania. Social distancing, you know, social distancing is still kind of with us today, isn't it? Like a lot of times when I go into a store, I more or less everybody kind of stands 6 feet from each other, right? It's one of those things that came around and kind of stuck. And a lot of places you go, you can still see the stickers on the floor. I guess they put them up overnight, and I guess they feel no real desire to remove them. The stickers were everywhere basically overnight. So were those plexiglass barriers that came up basically everywhere overnight. And yeah, social distancing just became, I mean, in British Columbia, they tried to change the word halfway through from social distancing to, I can't remember what else it was called. They, how they always need to have some more favorable word for something. Whatever it was, it didn't stick, and social distancing did stick. And I thought this was incredibly damaging for kids at this time. I mean, one thing that happened is we went by a playground, and I had a 3-year-old daughter, and she was at the age where she just was really into going to playgrounds and playing on playgrounds. And we went to a playground, and it was all taped off. It was all taped off, and that was strictly enforced. And I can't think of anything, that's just potentially damaging and just stupid than taping off a playground. um, you know, we were getting, reports of teenagers being fined or whatever for congregating in groups of 3 or 4, and this is at an age where social development is extremely important, right? For kids, teens, people graduating that year, people that had sports careers, in jeopardy or whatever else, completely derailed, right? Just for all of that. I mean, that was kids really got screwed in that early phase, as did a lot of senior citizens. Now, I know, I know a lot of senior citizens died. A lot of older people 80 plus died. Um, and through COVID, or maybe with COVID, but it was fairly damaging at old folks' homes. And I don't know, you wonder, probably the thing would have been just to have kind of a sort of sealed off environment for those sorts of people, and then maybe 1 or 2 people that they were given access to. I mean, that was another thing that just in retrospect, and even at the time, it just seems really cruel if you have someone that's in their 80s, they don't have much time left in their life, they're completely isolated. I think you'll find if you've ever been in that situation, I have seen people in that situation. Old people will tend to deteriorate physically and mentally really quickly if they're isolated like that. That was another cruel, cruel thing. And so much concern was over overwhelming hospitals, and yet hospitals were empty. And how many people had diseases that were made worse, or injuries or illnesses that weren't treated properly because they weren't able or didn't feel comfortable or didn't want to go to a hospital. I mean, that was another thing that was just really absolutely insane. The mask mandates, first masks were supposed to be ineffective, well, then they were mandatory. And then, you would go around and you would have these mask zealots that if the mask is below your nose, oh, I'm going to point it out. We'd see fights from people over masks, some people claiming they're exempt from wearing masks and they don't have to because they have some sort of asthma or something like that. Other people saying, I don't give a shit, wear a mask because we're all going to die. And that's kind of how it went down, right? I mean, the mask thing was a very, very contentious issue. And, you know, you can see why, because they were shown early on not to be effective. So once you say that, then if you suddenly say, oh, well, they are effective, you're really playing with your credibility and forcing people to strap something on and cover their face whenever they go out in public is, if not humiliating, it's kind of subjugating them, right? Let's face it. And again, it's just something that really hurts people socially. And I think you see a lot of effects from this stuff with, again, young people especially they're not as comfortable. You look at people that are under maybe 18 years of age, maybe under 15 years of age, they're nowhere near as comfortable socially with their peers as people from my generation would be, and even younger than me and older, of course, than me, right? Businesses and school closures, we kind of got into that a bit, and the business closures, economically, that damage is still reverberating. GNC is a company I did a lot of business with, a lot of business, and it almost disappeared completely overnight because most of their stores were in malls, right? And now they've pulled out of Canada completely. They've never really recovered. They went bankrupt soon after that, never really recovered. So, how many people lost jobs? How many people lost their livelihood through that? Um, you know, there's a number out there, right? Um, Restaurants, hairdressers, gyms, gym owners, I mean, another really, really misguided feature was kind of the attack on anything health and fitness related, which, healthy people were almost at no danger at all from COVID. I mean, I do know some people that have gotten COVID and, were laid up pretty badly with it. But in general, anybody that was healthy and fit and active, no problem, right? Um, as a matter of fact, where I used to live in Surrey, I lived about, a block or two from the beach, and you could walk down the stairs to the beach, and the stairs were closed for, I think they kept them closed for close to 2 years, close to 2 years, on the odd chance that somebody might pass another person going down the stairs and get COVID and die, right? Like, I mean, what level of paranoia is that? Capacity limits in restaurants, again, the plexiglass. Yeah, that was all part of the insane first phase reaction. The first phase reaction, I think we can characterize it by paranoia and insanity. Those were kind of the overwhelming directions, right? And I mean, that's more among the population. Among the people in charge, who knows? Probably greed is a big thing. And maybe some of them are just stupid as well, right? But then we moved into, and I had quite a bit of experience with the whole quarantine thing because I traveled to a few places in 2021, even in 2020. Once they opened up the flights, I was flying. And, I was forced to quarantine. I got a video on here, 3 days in a quarantine hotel. I was the last person in Canada to quarantine because the quarantine edict ended on I think it was midnight, like August 9th, 2021, or sometime around there. And my 3 day stay ended like, I don't know, an hour or so after that. So yeah, I was like, I was the last quarantine man. And that was another thing that was idiotic because they tried to push the enforcement off onto hotel owners and managers. And come on, man, you've seen a lot of these hotel managers. They can barely manage the hotel itself. Like, I mean, you're going to throw this stuff on them as well. That was a disaster. And I could get into details on how easy that was to kind of, game the system or mess around, but I won't. I won't divulge that kind of stuff. So yeah, quarantines. I had people coming by my apartment to check and make sure I was quarantined. These what were they called? They were kind of like auxiliary, like somebody that would check a meter, not a cop, but someone in a uniform coming around checking. Had that a few times. Um, but then we got into the next phase. And the next phase, once they cranked out the vaccine, well, that's when things really started to get ugly. Really started to get ugly because that's when people started turning on each other to a much greater degree. And people that did everything they were told, did the quarantining, the social distancing, everything else, followed it to the letter, lined up first to get that vaccine, and then still had to quarantine. Understandably, they were extremely frustrated and pissed off. But the problem was they were pissed off at the wrong people. They were pissed off at the people that didn't get the vaccine. And really, I mean, if you've been vaccinated, you should be fine, right? And it should mean it shouldn't matter to you what anybody else does because you've been vaccinated. It's like if you put on a bulletproof vest, well, you're okay. You shouldn't care if anybody else is wearing a bulletproof vest, right? You can only look after yourself. But it was like getting a bulletproof vest and then people saying, okay, but just to be clear, this doesn't actually stop bullets. Kind of what they were saying, right? Um, we had a significant portion of the population treated like second class citizens. I know because I was one. Surrey, BC, a city I lived in virtually my whole life. I was at a stage where I couldn't go into a restaurant. I couldn't go into any public place. I was, despite volunteering and giving up my time to coach a football team for the entire season, I was not even allowed on the sidelines for the last game of the season because I had not been vaccinated. And I mean, that's just, and people come up with these things, but the people that really also have to look at themselves are the ones that push this and try to enforce it on everybody else. Because regimes and governments, they can't do this stuff without a whole bunch of willing people. They can't have a cop in every house, can they? It's you guys out there that push everybody else on and act like these zealous watchdogs that allow them to get away with this kind of stuff, right? Um, and if you questioned whether it was a good idea to take the vaccine, you were a conspiracy theorist, right? Um, and early on, there was information coming out that there's increased risks of heart attacks, strokes, and even cancers. And now all of those concerns are openly discussed in the mainstream media. So they've all been proven more or less correct, right? Um, just being banned from everything and people saying, well, I hope they die. If they don't take a vaccine, I hope they die. I heard a lot of that, unfortunately. Um, and then, things just started unraveling there. It's, I won't get into the details too much more because we all know, and who really wants to go through it again, right? But I mean, it was a very, very dark time. And I think the scars are still with us. And there's some other interesting stuff that we can look at. For example, when we have stuff like this, you always have to ask yourself, I wonder who got rich? Because money's always kind of behind these things, isn't it? It seems basic, but it's almost always money, right? Hang on a second. Let me get the old glasses. See, that's the thing now. I'm getting older, man. Got to use reading glasses. So the top five companies that benefited the most during the pandemic. Amazon, yep. Uh, Toilet paper sales jumped 186% on Amazon. Cold and cough medicines surged by 862% year over year. Amazon never looked back. Microsoft, did extremely well. Apple did extremely well. Uh, Tesla and Elon Musk, Facebook, and even other things like Zoom. I mean, how many people were familiar with Zoom before this? I mean, I knew about it because I'd used it, but only probably about a year before that is when I started using Zoom. And yeah, in the early stages, when people are shut in, it's all the mega corporations that are going to benefit, right? And they've never really done anything for small companies. Yeah, sure, there was a CERB. I reduced my pay and I took the CERB for I think it was 10 months, and I was forced to pay every single bit of it back. And that was kind of the last straw with me. I was just so pissed off, man. So pissed off. So I essentially for that entire year made nothing. Worked, sat at home, did my work, nothing. Um, Now here's another interesting thing. So, who are some of the individuals that got a lot of money during COVID? Well, there's a lot. And but I figured I would zero in on just one. So, uh, who is he? Okay, David Klein. So, David Klein, CEO of the cannabis company Canopy Growth, scored the top spot in terms of companies getting paid by, this is just by the Canadian government. We could look at the US government, but I mean, we'd be here all day because I mean, there's just such a massive amount. So he got $45 million in total compensation. David Klein did. That's a lot, right? And I mean, selling pot during a pandemic and with all this lockdown and all that crap shouldn't have been too hard. But hey, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say he said, hey, I want to keep all my people employed. I'm going to do that. I'm going to preserve everybody's job. No layoffs here. Everybody's going to work. Help me out, government, and I'll pay you back. Well, he never did pay them back. Oh, what's this? February 2023. Wow. Canopy Growth CEO David Klein announced another round of job cuts that will affect 800 employees and result in the closure and consolidation of numerous facilities in Canada. Wow. November 22nd, Canopy Growth laying off 55 employees as it restructures its operations in Canada. So, yeah, they've laid off now over 80% of their workforce, right? But he got that money, right? And that's what happens every time. People get paid, people cash in, people see this as an opportunity. That's what happens. So, all of you guys out there, before you turn on your fellow citizens, before you know, attack the truck driver who maybe sits in his cab alone all day and doesn't want to get a vaccination or doesn't want to do something that he sees an extreme measure, don't hate him. Hate the guy that's pocketing $45 million and then laying his people off. Or hate the guy that approved that and made it possible for him to get that $45 million. Those are the real bastards out there, right? Let's keep that in mind. Because here's the funny thing. Well, it's not funny. So, one of the things I've always thought about with COVID is at some point, first of all, we pretty much know that it's man-made. I don't know if I'll get shadow banned again. I pointed this out in one of my videos that it came from the Wuhan virology lab in Wuhan, China, and that really did me in. But let's say another one of these comes out and it's way more effective. We're at the stage now where nobody's going to believe what our own government tells us, right? Like our own government could say this is a deadly virus that's making its way here, and they could be 100% correct. Are we going to believe them now? Or are we going to say, yeah, we've heard all that before? They've lost major, major credibility, right? So, I mean, if there is another virus, and there's bound to be one, and at some stage, there has to be one that is extremely deadly. How seriously are we going to take it, right? Something to consider. Anyways, that's it. Just a short retrospective, just to let you know I'm still out here alive. And if any, I'd love to hear in the comments if anybody does have any interesting stories from phase one or phase two of the whole COVID-19 fiasco. I'd love to hear how you were personally affected. I'll put some of my stuff in the comments as well. I didn't want to make this all about me and go into some of these things, but I will put something in the comments because, I consider myself fairly fortunate in that I lived in an area where, I had a full house, I had a large yard, my kids had siblings. So in that situation, isolation and things like that are not quite as bad. But I mean, so many times I just thought of, kids, for example, that maybe were alone in an apartment and had to spend all day, every day stuck inside an apartment alone. And maybe their only one escape was to go out and see friends or to go out and play sports, and all that was taken away from them. You know, those kind of kids are probably permanently damaged in all honesty. So let's keep that stuff in mind. Anyways, if you guys want to see my next video, I'll talk about why I left Canada. Until then, adios.